cheap perfume and stale beer, soaked into the carpet of our dorm room. That was the smell of my second chance. In my first life, I screamed, begged, and threw myself in front of Kaylee's ambitions, trying to stop her from keeping the billionaire's bastard. She thanked me by destroying my career and abandoning me in a hospice to rot. This time, I'm pouring the tea, fluffing her pillows, and watching her walk right into her own perfectly manicured hell. Nausea hit me before I even opened my eyes. Not the hollow, rattling sickness of the failing organs that had ended my previous life, but the sharp, acidic sting of cheap dining hall coffee and a sleep-deprived hangover. My fingers curled reflexively, scraping against the nubby synthetic texture of a twin XL mattress pad. No eye-vise pulling at the back of my hand. No rhythmic, artificial wheeze of a ventilator. Just the rattling hum of a mini-fridge in the corner of the room, fighting a losing battle against a blocked condenser coil. I forced my eyes open. The popcorn ceiling above me was stained with a faint, yellowish water, mark shaped vaguely like a skull. I knew that stain. I had spent hours staring at it. When I was 21, stressing over macroeconomics and student loans, I rolled onto my side, my joints popping with a fluid ease that felt entirely foreign. The air in the room was thick, smelling heavily of aerosol dry shampoo and the synthetic vanilla of Kaylee's signature lotion. My phone lay face down on the particle board nightstand. I grabbed it, the smooth glass, cool against my palm. The screen flared to life. May 14th. My lungs seized. The air suddenly felt too thick to breathe. I pressed the heel of my hand against my sternum, waiting for the phantom pain of tumors to radiate through my chest. But there was nothing. Just the rapid, heavy thumping of a healthy heart. A sharp click snapped my attention to the bathroom door. "Hallie," a voice called out. It was breathless, trembling, with a frantic, manufactured energy. Kaylee stepped into the main room. She was wearing my oversized gray sweatpants and a tight pink camisole. Her blonde hair, usually straightened to a glossy perfection, was piled in a messy knot. In her right hand, she gripped a small, white plastic stick. Her knuckles were white. "Look," she whispered, holding it out like it was a winning lottery ticket. 2 pink lines, bright, undeniable, and screaming against the small rectangular window. A wave of vertigo washed over me. The smell of acetone nail polish remover wafted off her cuticles, stinging my nostrils and dragging me violently into the memory of my first life. In that life, I had reacted exactly how a panicked, fiercely loyal 21-year-old friend would. I had jumped out of bed, grabbed her by the shoulders, and told her the truth. I told her that Ashton Patterson wasn't just a wealthy older guy who liked to spoil college girls. He was the heir to a logistics empire deeply entrenched in a ruthless family structure and secretly engaged to a state senator's daughter. I had warned her that men like Ashton didn't marry girls who got pregnant by accident. They erased them. I had begged her to go to a clinic. When she cried about the cost, I emptied my meager savings account. I drove her there. I held her hand while she wept in the waiting room. And how did she repay me? 3 weeks later, when Ashton noticed she was distant and went through her phone, he found my texts arranging the appointment. To save her own skin, Kaylee told him I had coerced her. She told him I had threatened to get her kicked out of the university if she kept his child. Ashton's retaliation was swift and absolute. His family's lawyers buried my father's small contracting business in frivolous lawsuits until he went bankrupt. They ensured I was blacklisted from every graduate program in the state. Years later, when the stress and poverty manifested into late-stage illness, Kaylee was living in a penthouse, married, to a different tech executive. I reached out, begging for a loan to cover my treatments. She blocked my number. I looked at her, now standing in the center of our cramped dorm room, her eyes wide, waiting for my reaction. She wanted me to panic. She wanted an audience for her drama. She wanted a scapegoat. I took a slow, deep breath. The stale air tasted sweet. "Oh my God," I said, forcing my vocal cords to relax. I pitched my voice up, injecting it with a breathy, exaggerated warmth. "Kaylee, is that—" "I'm pregnant." She breathed, her lips curling into a hesitant, then triumphant smile. "It's Ashton's." I pushed the heavy synthetic blanket off my legs and stood up. I walked over to her, ignoring the absolute revulsion crawling up my spine, and threw my arms around her. Her collarbone felt sharp beneath her skin. "Congratulations," I whispered into her hair. "He's going to be so happy. You're going to be a mother." Kaylee pulled back, searching my face. There was a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. She had wanted a fight. She had wanted me to act like the practical, boring buzzkill, so she could play the romantic rebel. "You think he'll be happy?" she asked, her voice taking on a whiny, dependent edge. "He's so busy with the firm, and his family is intimidating." "Are you kidding?" I smiled, reaching out to gently squeeze her arm. The fabric of her camisole felt cheap between my fingers. "Men like Ashton, they care about legacy. You're carrying his heir, Kaylee. This changes everything for you." Her chest puffed out slightly. The seed was planted. The vanity she had always kept, barely concealed behind a mask of collegiate insecurity, was beginning to sprout. "You're right," she said, looking down at the plastic stick. "I need to tell him. I need to go shopping. I can't look like a broke college student when I break the news." I walked over to the mini fridge, pulled out a lukewarm bottle of water, and cracked the seal. The plastic cap snapped loudly in the quiet room. "Take my card." I lied, effortlessly, knowing my balance was currently $14. "Go buy something nice. You deserve it." She didn't even question it. She just nodded, her eyes already glazed over, with visions of diamonds and sprawling estates. I took a sip of the water. It tasted metallic, but it grounded me. I was alive, and this time, I wasn't going to be collateral damage. Weeks bled into one another, thick and suffocating, with the incoming summer heat. The air conditioning in our building had failed again, leaving the room smelling of old sweat and damp towels. But Kaylee didn't seem to notice the squalor anymore. She was already living in a different reality. She had maxed out 2 credit cards. She didn't have the income to pay off purchasing silk maternity blouses she didn't yet need, and a $400 designer diaper bag that sat ostentatiously on her unmade bed. Her side of the room became a shrine to a lifestyle she was attempting to manifest through sheer arrogance. I watched it all from my desk, quietly packing my life into small, manageable cardboard boxes. The rough rasp of packing tape, unspooling from the dispenser, became the soundtrack to my evenings. I had gone to the registrar's office 2 days after the positive test caching in every AP credit and overloaded semester I had banked. I was graduating early. I had a low-paying but secure internship lined up in a city 300 miles away, starting in mid-July. "Do you have to make that noise?" Kaylee snapped one Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, a layer of expensive foundation caked over a breakout on her chin. The hormones were starting to wage war on her complexion, and she was furious about it. "Sorry," I said, mildly, setting the tape down. "Just trying to get a head start. The lease is up in a month." "I won't be here anyway," she said, examining her manicured nails. Ashton is looking at places for us in the Heights. He says dorm life is too stressful for the baby. For us, it was fascinating how easily she wove the delusion. The first time I met Ashton in this life, it was exactly as chilling as the first time around. He had come to the dorm to pick her up for dinner. He didn't knock. He just pushed the heavy fire door open and stood in the frame. He was strikingly handsome, but in a sterile, architectural way. Sharp jawline, perfectly tailored charcoal suit hair, swept back with expensive pomade. But it was the smell that always hit me first. A heavy cloying mix of sandalwood cologne and something sharply metallic, like coins, held tightly in a sweaty palm. "You must be Hallie," he had said, his eyes scanning the room, assessing its cheapness, its dirt, and finally settling on me. His gaze was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the look of a man appraising a used car. "Nice to meet you," I had replied, leaning back in my desk chair and offering a vacant, agreeable smile. "Kaylee tells me you've been very supportive," he noted. The pause before the word supportive was deliberate. He was testing the waters, trying to figure out if I was going to be a problem. In my past life, I had glared at him, my hostility radiating off me in waves. This time, I let my eyes widen slightly, playing the naive, starstruck roommate. "Oh, of course, we're all just so thrilled for her. She talks about you constantly." Ashton's smile had tightened a muscle, feathering in his jaw. He didn't like people who were hard to read, but he hated people he deemed beneath his intellect even more. By playing the fool, I made myself invisible to him. He nodded once, dismissing me entirely, and turned to Kaylee. Now, sitting in the humid dorm, Kaylee was aggressively brushing her hair. "He's sending a car for me tonight," she announced. "We're meeting his family's trust lawyer." My hands paused on the flaps of a cardboard box. The cardboard was rough, leaching moisture from my fingertips. The trust lawyer. This was the pivot point. "A lawyer?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Is everything okay?" "It's just formalities," Kaylee scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Rich people stuff. Setting up a trust for the baby, getting my allowance sorted out. Ashton says his mother is very old school. She wants everything on paper." I bit the inside of my cheek, hard enough to taste copper. Old school. That was one way to describe Evelyn Patterson. Ruthless architect of human misery was another. I knew exactly what that paperwork was. It wasn't a trust for Kaylee. It was an ironclad, non-disclosure agreement, paired with a relinquishment of primary custody buried under layers of legalese and a monthly stipend that looked like a fortune to a broke college student. "That sounds amazing," I said, forcing my jaw to relax. "You're really stepping into a whole new world, Chloe." "I know," she sighed, a smug satisfaction settling over her features. She pulled a silk slip dress over her head, the static electricity making it cling to her thighs. "I just wish you could experience something like this, Hallie. You're always just grinding away. It's sad." I looked at her, really looked at her. Her skin was sallow beneath the makeup, the whites of her eyes slightly yellowed from exhaustion and poor diet. She was a lamb willingly walking into an industrial slaughterhouse, pausing only to brag to the other sheep about the luxurious transport truck. "I'll be fine," I said quietly, turning back to my box. "You just focus on reading that paperwork. Make sure you get everything you deserve." She let out a short, mocking laugh. "Ashton wouldn't screw me over. He loves me." The sound of the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind her echoed in the quiet room. I stared at the space she had just occupied. My hands were trembling slightly, a delayed physiological reaction to the adrenaline of holding back my own trauma. I took a deep breath, letting the smell of dust and old cardboard fill my lungs. Let her sign it. It wasn't my signature. It wasn't my life. I picked up the tape dispenser and pulled a long, loud strip across the top of the box. The following Tuesday, the Blacktown car arrived. It idled by the curb outside our concrete block of a dormitory, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh, midday sun. The engine purred with a deep, expensive vibration that I could feel in the soles of my cheap canvas sneakers as I stood on the sidewalk. Kaylee was moving out. She had returned from the lawyer's office 3 days prior, vibrating with a manic, almost aggressive energy. She had slapped a thick manila folder onto her desk and declared she was officially a Patterson. When I asked if she had read the documents, she waved a dismissive hand, claiming the legal jargon gave her a headache, and that Ashton had summarized it perfectly. A penthouse in the Heights. She had crowed, throwing her cheap clothes into garbage bags. She wasn't packing them to take. She was throwing them away. A dedicated driver, a monthly clothing allowance. Hallie, I don't even have to look at the prices on menus anymore. Now, a man in a dark suit, who looked far more like private security than a chauffeur, was loading her brand new, matching leather luggage into the trunk. The heavy thud of the trunk closing sounded like a vault sealing shut. Well, Kaylee said, turning to me. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses that obscured half her face, a clear attempt to mimic the paparazzi-dodging celebrities she worshipped. The humidity was already ruining the blowout she had paid too much for that morning. I guess this is it. Looks like it, I replied, keeping my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my denim jacket. The metal rivets dug into my knuckles. I'd invite you over to see the place. She continued, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. But Ashton is really weird about security. The building has biometric scanners and everything. It's a whole process to get guests cleared. I understand, I said. And I did. I understood perfectly. A biometric lock works 2 ways. It keeps unwanted people out, and it keeps unwanted people in. She wasn't moving into a home. She was moving into a heavily monitored holding cell until she delivered the Patterson heir. I'll text you, she promised, though her eyes were already darting toward the open door of the town car, eager to sink into the plush leather interior. Take care of yourself, Kaylee, I said. It was the most honest thing I had said to her since the day I woke up in this second life. Make sure you eat well. For the baby. She smiled, a brittle practiced thing. I have a private chef now, Hallie. I think I'll be fine. She turned and slid into the back seat. The door clicked shut with a solid, expensive thwack. The tinted glass rolled up, obscuring her face entirely. The car pulled away from the curb, smoothly merging into the campus traffic and disappearing around the corner. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time. The smell of exhaust fumes hung in the hot air, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass from the campus lawns. In my past life, this was the exact week I had lost everything. This was the week my father had called me, his voice breaking, to tell me his contracts had been inexplicably canceled. This was the week my academic advisor looked me in the eye and told me an anonymous ethics complaint had ruined my chances at the fellowship. I waited for the crushing weight of panic to hit me. I waited for the sensation of the floor dropping out from underneath my feet. Instead, there was just quiet, a slow, creeping warmth spread through my chest. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened my email. Sitting at the top of my inbox was a confirmation from the university. My final transcripts were processed. My degree was secured. Below it was an email from my new landlord in the city confirming the deposit on my studio apartment. I was free. I turned and walked back into the dorm building. The heavy glass doors sighed shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the street. I walked past the front desk, past the bulletin boards, plastered with flyers for frat parties and study groups, and took the stairs up to the third floor. When I unlocked the door to my room, it felt different. Kaylee's side was completely barren. The mattress was stripped, the desk was empty, and the suffocating smell of her vanilla lotion was already beginning to fade, replaced by the neutral, dusty scent of the cinder block walls. I walked over to my desk, sat down, and opened my laptop. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel righteous. There was a dark, ugly knot of guilt sitting in the pit of my stomach, a remnant of the girl I used to be, the girl who would have bled herself dry to save a friend. But I touched the back of my hand, tracing the smooth, unblemished skin where an IV needle had once left a permanent purple bruise. I opened a blank document and began typing out an outline for my internship orientation. I didn't owe Kaylee Turner my life. She had made her choice, lured by the gleam of old money and the promise of a life without consequence. I knew the darkness waiting for her at the end of that black town car's route. I knew the cold, sterile room she would eventually be moved to when Ashton's mother decided she was no longer a suitable environment for their genetic material. I knew it all, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I simply didn't care. August cracked the city open like a roasted seed. Heat radiated from the asphalt, invisible waves, carrying the suffocating smells of hot garbage exhaust fumes and roasting nuts from the corner vendors. My new studio apartment was little more than a glorified closet above a dry cleaner. But to me, the faint, persistent chemical odor of perchloroethylene drifting up through the floorboards smelled like absolute victory. My mattress rested directly on the warped hardwood floor. I didn't have a frame yet, nor did I have a television or a dining table. I had a single wobbly chair, a coffee maker I'd bought at a thrift store, and a stack of heavily highlighted training manuals from my new job. Every morning, I woke up at 6, brewed a cup of acidic, burnt-tasting coffee, and sat by the single window overlooking the alley. I listened to the rhythmic clanging of the garbage trucks and the angry honking of commuters. It was gritty, it was exhausting, and I had never felt more secure. At my data analytics internship, I was a ghost. I kept my head down, wore cheap, severely pressed slacks, and aggressively avoided office politics. The lanyard around my neck scratched my collarbone, a constant grounding physical sensation. In my previous life, I had been the girl who baked cupcakes for coworkers' birthdays and stayed late to help others finish their projects. That girl died in a sterile room, coughing up blood, while her friends ignored her calls. This time, I clocked out at exactly 5:15, left my laptop on my desk, and walked home. Kaylee's first message arrived during the second week of September. I was sitting on my floor, eating a bowl of instant ramen. The MSG broth was salty and intensely satisfying. My phone buzzed against the wood, a harsh grating vibration. The screen lit up the dim room. Kaylee Halley, this chef, is psychotic. He threw away my hidden stash of chips, said sodium causes edema, and Evelyn wants my blood pressure monitored hourly. I stopped chewing. A long, slippery noodle hung from my chopsticks. I stared at the glowing blue bubble of text. Evelyn, Ashton's mother, had entered the chat. The matriarch of the Patterson fortune didn't just manage the family's money. She managed their genetics. I knew from my past life's peripheral knowledge that Evelyn viewed Kaylee not as a human being, but as a temporary, unfortunate biological vessel. I swallowed the noodles. The broth suddenly tasted metallic. I typed back, keeping my tone, carefully, oblivious. Hallie. Wow. Rich people problems, right? At least you don't have to cook. The reply was instantaneous. The 3 gray typing dots barely flashed before a block of text appeared. Kaylee, it's not just the food. They took my phone yesterday to install security updates. Now half my apps are gone, and the browser history is locked, and Ashton is never here. He comes by on Sundays, kisses my forehead, talks to my stomach, and leaves. Hallie, I'm bored. The driver won't even take me to the mall anymore. He says public spaces are an unnecessary risk to the baby. My thumb hovered over the screen. The screen's backlight cast a harsh glare over the tiny, cramped apartment I was paying for with my own sweat. I could feel the old, ingrained urge rising in my chest, the frantic, codependent need to fix her problem, to call an Uber, to tell her to pack a bag, and I would hide her. My pulse kicked up. The room felt suddenly warm. I closed my eyes and forced myself to remember the texture of the thin, scratchy hospital blanket from my first life. I remembered the smell of bleach and impending death. I remembered the absolute crushing silence of being entirely abandoned. The savior complex died, suffocated by the memory of my own corpse. I opened my eyes and typed, Hallie, that's just high-level security, Chloe. Ashton is protecting his heir. Put on a movie and enjoy the penthouse view. You literally have millions of dollars waiting for you. I locked the phone and tossed it onto the mattress. It buzzed twice more over the next hour. I didn't look at it. I finished my ramen, washed the single bowl in the tiny sink, and went to sleep to the lullaby of police sirens. By October, the messages had stopped being annoying and started becoming unhinged. The tone shifted from entitled complaints to a creeping claustrophobic paranoia. Kaylee, the prenatal yoga instructor, doesn't even teach me poses. She just measures my waist and checks my ankles for swelling and reports it into an iPad. Kaylee, I tried to order a pizza on the landline. The concierge canceled it. Said he has strict instructions regarding unapproved deliveries to this unit. Kaylee Haley. The door locks from the outside. I tried to go into the hallway, just to walk around, and the keypad flashed red. I'm locked in. I read that last text. While standing on a crowded subway train, my shoulder wedged against a damp window. The train lurched, throwing me against a man in a damp wool coat. He muttered a curse. I apologized, automatically, grabbing the metal overhead bar to steady myself. The metal was freezing greasy, from 1,000 unwashed hands. Locked in, she was realizing the bars of the cage were made of steel, not gold. The Patterson family wasn't waiting for a baby. They were incubating an asset, and assets were kept in secure vaults. I drafted a reply. Call the police if you feel unsafe. I stared at the words. If she called the police, Evelyn's lawyers would descend like vultures. They would claim Kaylee was having a severe, hormonally induced mental health crisis. They would have her legally committed to a private luxury psychiatric facility. She would be drugged, managed, and hidden away entirely until the birth. It was exactly what they did to Ashton's first fiancé in my previous life when she tried to leave. I deleted the draft. Hallie, you're pregnant and stressed. Just breathe. It'll all be worth it when the baby is born and you get your trust fund. I hit send, slipped the phone into my pocket, and stepped off the train into the freezing autumn rain. I didn't look back. November brought a bitter biting wind that rattled the poorly caulked windows of my apartment. The draft smelled of wet concrete and dead leaves. I was sitting on my floor at 2 a.m, wrapped in a thick fleece blanket, organizing spreadsheets for a massive end-of-year review at the firm. I had just been offered a permanent salaried position, starting in January. It wasn't 6 figures, but it was enough to buy a bed frame and real groceries. My phone, resting on the stack of textbooks next to me, began to vibrate violently. It wasn't a text notification. It was a call. The screen flashed a blocked number. I stared at it for a long moment. The logical, newly hardened part of my brain screamed at me to let it ring out. But a morbid curiosity, dark and heavy, anchored me to the spot. I reached out and swiped the green icon. "Hello," I said, my voice raspy from disuse. "Hallie." The word was a wet, ragged gasp. It didn't even sound like her. The vocal fry, the manufactured arrogance, the breezy sorority girl cadence, it was all completely gone. The voice on the other end of the line was thin, hollowed out, and trembling with a primal animalistic panic. "Kaylee," I asked, keeping my tone perfectly sad. "Hallie, please don't hang up. Please." I could hear a faint, rhythmic clicking in the background. It sounded like fingernails tapping frantically against glass. I had to bribe the night nurse with my diamond earrings just to let me use her burner phone. They took mine. They took everything. I shifted my weight, the cold floor biting into my tailbone through the blanket. "Night nurse. Why do you have a night nurse? You're only 6 months along." A broken, hysterical sob cracked through the speaker. "She's not a nurse. She's a guard. Evelyn moved her in last week. She sleeps in the guest room. She monitors my water intake. She watches me swallow my vitamins." "Where is Ashton?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He's gone." Kaylee choked out her breath, hitching wildly. "He told me he was going to London for an acquisition. That was a month ago. I saw him on the news yesterday, Hallie. He was at a gala in New York with a woman, a senator's daughter. The exact same woman from my first life." The timeline was correcting itself, the players falling into their predetermined roles, completely oblivious to the script. "Kaylee, what do you want me to do?" I asked. The sheer lack of emotion in my own voice startled me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even vindictive. I was just tired, looking at a spreadsheet that needed formatting by 8 a.m. "You have to get me out," she begged, the desperation turning her voice shrill. "You were right. You warned me about him that first day in the dorm, and I didn't listen. I was stupid. I was so greedy, Hallie. I just wanted the clothes and the apartment. I never warned you about him." I corrected her smoothly, legally covering my tracks, even in a private conversation. "I supported your choices. You told me this was a fairy tale." "Stop it," she shrieked, the sound muffled instantly, as if she had clamped a hand over her mouth. When she spoke again, it was a frantic, rushed whisper. "Please." I read the rest of the papers, the ones I signed that day in the lawyer's office. My fingers tightened around the edges of the fleece blanket. And Clause 4. She sobbed the words, tumbling over each other in her rush to get them out. Relinquishment of maternal rights upon severing of the umbilical cord. Hallie, they aren't giving me a trust fund. They're giving me a one-time payout of $50,000, contingent on me signing a permanent non-disclosure agreement and leaving the state within 48 hours of discharge. If I fight it, if I try to see the baby, I forfeit the money, and they ruin me, legally. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. In my past life, this was the secret she had kept from me, while I drained my bank accounts to support her. This was the reality she had been running from when she threw me under Ashton's bus to buy herself a little more time in the penthouse. She had always known what she signed. She had just thought she was pretty enough, clever enough to change a billionaire's mind before the due date. 50,000 is a lot of money to start over with, I said, quietly. Are you insane? She hissed, genuine fury, briefly piercing her panic. I'm carrying his child. I'm trapped in a glass box. I haven't breathed fresh air in 3 weeks. I am a prisoner. Hallie, call the police. Tell them I'm being held hostage. You aren't a hostage, Kaylee, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. You signed a contract. You accepted the clothing allowance. You willingly moved into a secured facility to gestate an heir for a wealthy family in exchange for compensation. The police will look at your signature, look at the luxury penthouse, and arrest me for wasting their time. Hallie, her voice broke, completely shattering into a pathetic whimpering whine. Please, we're friends. You're my best friend. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me one last time. The beep of the heart monitor, the smell of cheap hospital pudding, the unread text messages on my dying phone. Kaylee, please. I just need 1,000 for the next round of chemo. I'm begging you. And the harsh absolute finality of the message undelivered notification when she blocked my number. I opened my eyes. The spreadsheet on my laptop glowed brightly. I'm not your friend, Kaylee, I said, my voice completely devoid of inflection. I was your roommate. You made a business transaction. Now you have to finish the job. You cold bitch. She spat the terror, morphing instantly into venom. It was the real Kaylee, finally clawing her way to the surface. I'll tell them about you. I'll tell Evelyn you knew. Knew what? I asked softly. That you were pregnant? Of course I knew. I congratulated you. I packed your boxes. I'm entirely irrelevant to your contract. A heavy muffled thud echoed through the phone, followed by a sharp gasp. Who gave you that phone? A cold, unfamiliar woman's voice demanded in the background. The guard. No, please, I was just... Kaylee's plea was cut off abruptly. The line went dead. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear. The plastic casing was warm against my skin. I sat in the silence of my cramped, freezing apartment for a long time, listening to the wind howl against the brick exterior. My hands weren't shaking. My chest didn't ache. I reached out, selected the blocked number from my recent calls list, and pressed delete. Then I pulled my laptop closer, adjusted the margins on my spreadsheet, and went back to work. February. Slush crusted the hem of my slacks, freezing into stiff, dirty ridges, by the time I pushed through the revolving doors of my office building. The lobby smelled of heavy industrial floor wax and damp wool. I swiped my keycard, the satisfying beep, granting me access to the elevator bank. My reflection in the brushed steel doors showed a woman who looked tired, yes, but undeniably alive. The dark circles under my eyes were from 60-hour work weeks running data models, not failing kidneys. My new title was junior analyst. It came with a cubicle on the 14th floor, a dual monitor setup, and a salary that allowed me to finally purchase a sturdy metal bed frame. The physical ache in my lower back from sleeping on the floor had vanished, replaced by the dull, persistent strain of staring at spreadsheets until the numbers blurred into gray lines. It was a Tuesday morning when the outside world finally bled into my carefully constructed isolation. I was standing in the break room, waiting for the commercial coffee machine to finish dripping a sludgy, bitter brew into my mug. The fluorescent lights overhead emitted a high-pitched, mosquito-like hum that always set my teeth on edge. A senior associate named Greg had left his copy of a high society business quarterly on the counter. The glossy cover caught the harsh overhead light, practically illuminating the predator smile of Ashton Patterson. My hand stopped mid-reach. The air in the break room suddenly felt entirely depleted of oxygen, leaving behind the sharp, acidic tang of burnt coffee. I hooked a finger under the edge of the magazine and pulled it toward me. The paper was heavy, expensive, and cold to the touch. Ashton was wearing a midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than my annual gross income. He was standing on a sweeping marble staircase, and clinging to his arm, looking up at him with a practiced porcelain smile, was Amelia Vance, the state senator's daughter. A merger of dynasties. The headline blared in elegant serif font. Patterson Logistics secures political ties. Ahead of quarter 3 expansion. I flipped the heavy pages, my thumb leaving faint, sweaty smudges on the high-gloss paper. The article spanned 4 pages. It detailed their whirlwind romance, their shared philanthropic interests, and their upcoming summer wedding in the Hamptons. Evelyn Patterson was quoted extensively, praising Amelia's pedigree and her suitability for the family's legacy. Nowhere in the 4,000 words of corporate sycophancy was there a single mention of a college sophomore named Kaylee Turner. I traced the edge of the page. By my calculation, Kaylee was entering her 8th month. She was heavily pregnant, trapped in a biometric vault, while the man who put her there was publicly parading his future wife for the financial press. A dark, ugly knot of vindication twisted in my gut, immediately chased by a wave of nausea. I hadn't warned her, and this was the result. The trap had sprung shut so completely that it was entirely invisible to the outside world. "Hey, Hallie, you done with the pot?" I jumped, dropping the magazine onto the counter with a loud smack. Greg was standing in the doorway, a ceramic mug in his hand, looking at me with mild irritation. "Yeah," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I cleared my throat, forcing the pitch back down to a professional, detached level. "Just finished. It's all yours." I grabbed my mug and walked back to my cubicle. The fabric of my chair scratched against my thighs as I sat down. I stared at the blank screensaver bouncing across my monitors. In my past life, I would have taken a screenshot of the article, sent it to Kaylee, and tried to organize a rescue mission. I would have called lawyers. I would have screamed at the injustice of it all until my throat bled. Instead, I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee. It burned the roof of my mouth, a sharp, grounding pain. Ashton's public engagement meant Evelyn's cleanup operation was in its final stages. They were securing the narrative. When the child was born, it would be presented as a miracle of modern medicine, a private surrogate arrangement to bless the newlywed couple. The biological mother would be reduced to a heavily redacted line item in a non-disclosure agreement. I opened my email client and began sorting through the morning's data requests. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the plastic keys clattering in a rhythmic, comforting cadence. I was building a fortress of mundane, boring stability. Every cell I formatted, every pivot table I built, was another brick between me and the wreckage of my past life. I didn't owe her a rescue. She had built her own cage, entirely mesmerized by the gold plating on the bars. I just had to keep my head down and survive the fallout. April dragged its heels, bringing endless days of bone-chilling drizzle that coated the city in a permanent, slippery film of gray. My apartment smelled constantly of wet umbrellas and the faint, sulfurous odor of the radiator, struggling to output heat. The news didn't come with a frantic phone call or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived in the most sanitized, clinical way possible. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was on my lunch break, sitting on a damp wooden bench in a plaza near my office, chewing mechanically on a stale turkey sandwich. The bread stuck to the roof of my mouth, tasting of cheap mayonnaise and wilted lettuce. I was scrolling aimlessly through a financial news aggregator app on my phone, tracking market trends for an afternoon presentation. My thumb froze over a small secondary headline tucked beneath an article about offshore drilling. Patterson Airborne. Logistics Dynasty secures. Next generation. The sandwich suddenly felt like a lump of lead in my throat. I swallowed hard, the sharp crust scraping down my esophagus, and tapped the link. The page loaded slowly, the little blue bar creeping across the top of the screen like a countdown timer. It was a short press release, barely 3 paragraphs long. Ashton Patterson and his fiancée Amelia are thrilled to announce the arrival of their son, Ashton William Patterson, the fourth born, Tuesday evening. The couple, who are set to wed in July, welcome the child via a private contracted surrogate. Evelyn Patterson, the family matriarch, issued a statement expressing the family's profound joy and requesting privacy during this intimate time. Private, contracted, surrogate, 3 words. That was the entirety of Kaylee Turner's existence in the historical record of the Patterson family. They had stripped her of her motherhood, her dignity, and her name, packaging the trauma into a neat, legally unassailable soundbite for the shareholders. I locked my phone and shoved it deep into my coat pocket. The screen burned cold against my thigh. Through the thin lining, my breathing grew shallow. A sudden violent tremor started in my hands, radiating up my forearms. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and buried my face in my palms. The smell of exhaust fumes and wet concrete filled my nose. I wasn't crying. My eyes were entirely dry. It was purely a physiological reaction, the body rejecting the sheer sociopathic scale of what had just occurred. I had known this was going to happen. I had lived through a version of it already. But knowing a train is going to crash, and actually watching the metal buckle and tear, are 2 entirely different things. A sickening wave of survivor's guilt washed over me, heavy and suffocating. If I had just fought harder, if I had dragged her out of that dorm room by her hair, if I had, no. I dug my fingernails into my scalp, the sharp pain piercing the rising panic. No, I remembered the texture of the hospital sheets. I remembered the absolute ringing silence of my father's empty house after the bankruptcy. I remembered Kaylee's voice on my voicemail, annoyed and dismissive, telling me to stop harassing her because her new husband didn't like her associating with depressing people. I sat up straight. The wind whipped across the plaza, chilling the sweat that had broken out on the back of my neck. I was not a hero. I was a survivor in a lifeboat, and I had simply refused to let a drowning, thrashing woman pull me under a second time. 3 weeks later, the universe delivered the final, ugly punchline. I was at the regional transit hub on the edge of the city, waiting to board a commuter train to visit a client data center. The terminal was a cavernous, echoing concrete dome, smelling aggressively of diesel fuel, Auntie Anne's cinnamon pretzels, and unwashed bodies. I was holding a paper cup of tea, letting the heat seep into my numb fingers, when a flash of movement caught my eye. Near the ticket counters for the cheap, long-haul interstate buses, a woman was struggling with a jammed suitcase zipper. She was thin, hollowed out, and angular in a way that spoke of sudden, traumatic weight loss. She wore a bulky, shapeless gray hoodie, in cheap sweatpants that dragged on the dirty tile floor. Her blonde hair, once her crowning glory, hung in brittle, uneven strands around her face, devoid of any gloss or styling. It was Kaylee. My boots cemented themselves to the floor. The ambient noise of the terminal, the automated boarding announcements, the screeching of train brakes, the dull roar of 1,000 conversations faded into a heavy, ringing static in my ears. She yanked violently at the zipper. The cheap metal gave way, tearing the fabric of the bag. A few mundane items spilled onto the floor: a plain white t-shirt, a generic toothbrush, a hard plastic travel case. No silk blouses, no designer bags, no diamond earrings. She dropped to her knees to gather her things. As she reached for the toothbrush, she turned her head, giving me a clear view of her profile. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, pulled tight over her cheekbones. But it was her eyes that made my stomach drop into my shoes. They were entirely vacant. The arrogant, vibrant spark that had defined her, the vanity that had led her into Evelyn Patterson's slaughterhouse, was extinguished. She looked like a shell that had been scraped clean on the inside and left to dry in the sun. She had $50,000 in a bank account, somewhere legally gagged and banished from the state, carrying the permanent invisible scar of a child she would never be allowed to see again. A woman holding a toddler bumped into Kaylee's shoulder as she passed. "Watch it," the woman snapped. Kaylee didn't react. She didn't glare. She didn't speak. She just flinched a small, battered withdrawal into herself and continued stuffing her cheap clothes into the broken bag. My heart hammered against my ribs. Like a trapped bird, I was less than 50 feet away. I could walk over. I could buy her a coffee. I could offer her the floor of my cramped apartment, just for a few nights, until she figured out where to go. The ghost of the girl I used to be screamed at me to move my feet. I looked down at my hands. I was holding a leather briefcase. Inside were the analytics reports I had stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting. I had a 401k now. I had a life. I looked back at Kaylee. She stood up, clutching the broken bag to her chest, and shuffled toward the boarding gate for a bus bound for the Midwest. I didn't call her name. I didn't step forward. I turned my back on her, walked toward my train platform, and disappeared into the crowd. Fluorescent lights in the senior partners conference room buzzed with the frequency of a dying wasp. It was a subtle grating noise that most people tuned out, but my ears picked it up immediately. I sat at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, the wood smooth and cool beneath my forearms. My tailored blazer pinched slightly at the shoulders, a physical reminder of the armor I now wore every single day. 3 years had passed since the afternoon I watched Kaylee Turner drag a broken suitcase through a bus terminal. 3 years of 70-hour weeks, ruthless networking, and climbing over the wreckage of my colleagues' burnout to secure a position as a senior risk analyst. The heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open, pulling a vacuum of air that rustled the stacks of printed financial disclosures in front of me. Ashton Patterson walked in. My heart did not skip a beat. My lungs did not seize. I just sat, perfectly still, my hands folded neatly over my tablet. He looked older. The sharp, architectural perfection of his jawline was slightly blurred by the subtle, puffy fatigue of a man who worked too much and slept too little. But the smell was exactly the same. The heavy, suffocating wave of expensive sandalwood cologne hit the back of my throat, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of unyielding arrogance. He was flanked by 3 lawyers and his chief financial officer. Patterson Logistics was acquiring a massive, unionized regional freight carrier, and our firm was running the liability models. Ashton didn't even look at me. He swept his eyes over the room, acknowledged the senior partners with a curt nod, and took his seat at the head of the table. To him, I was merely background noise. I was a female analyst in a dark suit, holding a stylus entirely invisible within the machinery of his corporate empire. He had no idea that I knew the exact layout of his penthouse, the name of his mother's preferred security firm, or the brand of the plastic pregnancy test that had temporarily derailed his life 4 years ago. Let's bypass the pleasantries. Ashton said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded immediate silence. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, the expensive silk lining flashing briefly. I want the risk assessment on the pension liabilities, and I want to know exactly how much blood this union is going to try to squeeze from us during the transition. The meeting dragged on for 3 grueling hours. I spoke only when spoken to, delivering stark, unsentimental data regarding employee attrition rates. When I spoke, Ashton stared at my forehead, absorbing the numbers without ever actually registering my face. It was the ultimate perverse victory. By erasing my empathy, I had successfully erased my vulnerability. After the meeting adjourned and the executives filed out, leaving behind the stale scent of catered coffee and tension, I remained at the table to compile the digital ledgers. My assigned task was auditing a specific, highly confidential subsidiary account labeled Patterson Family Discretionary Legal. It was the slush fund, the account used to bury the mistakes, the indiscretions, and the collateral damage of being unfathomably wealthy. I scrolled through the digitized spreadsheet, my eyes scanning the endless rows of redacted names and non-disclosure payouts, settlement for a property dispute, settlement for a damaged luxury vehicle. Then my finger stopped on the trackpad. Line item 402, date May 12th, exactly 3 years ago. The cell was categorized under miscellaneous contractual dispersals. The recipient name was heavily redacted with a thick black digital bar, but the routing number belonged to a small regional bank in the Midwest. The amount was $50,000. In the notes column, written in sterile, detached accounting shorthand, were 3 words that made the back of my neck prickle with a cold sweat: biological asset acquisition. I stared at the glowing pixels until they blurred. A human being, a 9-month pregnancy, a lifetime of psychological trauma, physical scarring, and absolute maternal severance. All of it boiled down to a $50,000 line item, classified as a biological asset. They hadn't even categorized her as a contractor or a medical expense. They categorized the transaction exactly like they would the purchase of a new fleet of shipping containers. I leaned back in the heavy leather ergonomic chair. The leather squeaked under my weight. In my first life, discovering this would have broken me. I would have felt a righteous, screaming fury on Kaylee's behalf. I would have printed the ledger, taken it to the press, and ruined my own career in a desperate, futile attempt to bring Ashton Patterson to justice. I would have bled out on the altar of a friendship that never truly existed. Now, I just felt a hollow, aching emptiness. It was the grim satisfaction of a weather forecaster watching a hurricane destroy a town they had warned to evacuate. I clicked the cell verified. The routing numbers matched the ledger totals and marked the line item as audited and cleared. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and packed it into my leather briefcase. The brass clasps snapped shut with a heavy final sound that echoed in the empty boardroom. I walked out of the glass doors, the smell of sandalwood finally fading from my nostrils, entirely unaffected by the ghosts of the Patterson Empire. Silence is an expensive commodity. In the city, true silence doesn't exist. But you can buy a very convincing simulation of it if you live high enough above the street and pay for triple-paned acoustic glass. My apartment was on the 28th floor. It was a minimalist, sterile space, all brushed steel matte black fixtures and cold, polished concrete floors. There were no decorative pillows. There was no cheap vanilla lotion. The air smelled faintly of ozone from the heavy-duty air purifier humming in the corner and the bitter, rich scent of the espresso I was brewing in the kitchen. It was a Sunday morning in late October, exactly 4.5 years since I woke up in that miserable dorm room. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, wearing a heavy textured linen robe. The fabric was rough, dragging pleasantly against my shoulders. Outside, a brutal autumn storm was battering the city. Sheets of gray rain lashed against the glass, distorting the skyline into a blurred, weeping smear of concrete and steel. I placed my palm against the window. The glass was freezing, transferring a sharp, stinging cold into my skin. I pressed harder, feeling the solid, unyielding barrier between myself and the chaos outside. I was healthy. My resting heart rate was 60 beats per minute. My blood panels were flawless. The phantom pain of failing organs that used to haunt my nightmares had finally faded into a dull, easily ignored memory. I turned away from the window and walked over to the kitchen island, picking up my phone. I tapped the screen, intending to check my work email, but a notification banner from an obscure, heavily filtered social media platform caught my eye. It was an app I kept purely for monitoring industry contacts, a graveyard of forgotten connections. One new message request. I opened the app. The profile picture was a default gray silhouette. The username was a random string of numbers, but the preview text made my thumb freeze midair. Hallie, please. I know you work at Vanguard Analytics now. I saw your promotion announcement on LinkedIn. I tapped the message, the screen, glowing harshly in the dim, gray morning light. It's Kaylee. I don't know who else to ask. The NDA prevents me from putting the last 4 years on my resume, so it looks like I just dropped out and disappeared. I'm living in Ohio. I'm trying to get a job at a logistics dispatch center, but they need a professional character reference from someone corporate to bypass the background check gap. The 50 grand is gone, Hallie. My mom got sick and the taxes. It just disappeared. My hands shake all the time now. I can't sleep. I just need one email, just one reference saying I'm reliable. Please, you're the only person from my old life who didn't block me. I read the block of text 3 times. The grammar was frantic, full of double spaces, and desperate punctuation. I could almost smell the stale anxiety rolling off the digital words. I could picture her sitting in some cramped, miserable apartment in the Midwest, typing furiously on a cracked smartphone, her glossy blonde hair completely ruined by cheap dye and chronic stress. You're the only person from my old life who didn't block me. The sheer, staggering narcissism of it made a short, dry laugh scrape up my throat. She honestly believed that our silence over the last 4 years was just a lapse in communication. She had completely compartmentalized her own betrayal from our first life and her arrogant dismissal of me in this one because she needed something. She was still the same girl who had demanded I hand over my meager bank account to solve a problem she had eagerly created. I walked back to the window, the espresso in my mug rapidly losing its heat. I thought about the Ashton William Patterson, the fourth, a toddler currently living in a biometric fortress, being raised by a rotating staff of nannies and a cold, political mother. I thought about the $50,000 ledger entry. I thought about the hospice bed I had died in, coughing up blood, while the nurses avoided looking me in the eye. I held the phone up my thumb, hovering over the small red decline and block button at the bottom of the screen. If I replied, if I sent that reference, it would be a small act of mercy. It would cost me nothing. It would take 5 minutes of my time. It was the human thing to do. But I was no longer the girl who set herself on fire to keep other people warm. I looked at my own reflection in the dark, rain-streaked glass. I saw a woman with hard eyes, a straight spine, and a bank account that ensured she would never be crushed by the machinery of someone else's ambition. I had paid for this life with the agonizing death of my previous one. Kaylee was simply paying the invoice for the choices she had made with her eyes wide open. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt an overwhelming, profound exhaustion regarding the entity known as Kaylee Turner. She was a ghost, a remnant of a timeline that I had successfully amputated. My thumb pressed down on the glass screen. The subtle haptic vibration buzzed against my skin. Request deleted. User blocked. The message vanished, leaving behind a blank, sterile inbox. I set the phone face down on the marble counter. The ceramic mug clinked softly against the stone as I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark espresso. The coffee was bitter, complex, and intensely grounding. I turned my back to the storm raging outside, pulled the heavy linen robe tighter around my shoulders, and walked into the quiet warmth of my second life. If you've ever had to watch someone dig their own grave after they handed you the shovel, you know exactly why I kept my mouth shut. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't anger. It's simply letting karma do its job without standing in the way. What do you think? Was I wrong for letting Kaylee walk into the trap? Or did she get exactly what she deserved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you're enjoying this dark dive into second chances, and make sure to subscribe.